Imagine this. You're standing in a cabin. The air is cold. Your breath curls in front of you, and on the bed, under sheets tucked tight, is a body, a corpse wrapped like a mummy, skin pale, feet blackened from frostbite. And you know, this man didn't die quick. No, he died slow, starving, freezing, while food sat untouched, just feet away. This isn't a horror story. This happened to a man named Ted Wire. And Ted wasn't alone. He was one of five men who walked into the Sierra Nevada mountains and never walked back out. No bloodbath, no gunshots, no ransom calls, just disappearance, followed by death. Strange, cruel, and laced with questions no one can answer. The newspapers called them the Yuba County Five, but their story, it's not just a mystery. It's a black hole. It pulls at you. The more you learn, the less sense it makes. Because this wasn't random. It wasn't careless. It wasn't the mistake of boys who didn't know better. They weren't thrill seekers. They weren't drunks. They weren't criminals. These men lived carefully. They planned everything. And yet, on a February night in 1978, they drove into darkness, into snow, into something that swallowed them whole. And here's the part that chills me the most. One of them, Gary Mathias, was never found. Not then, not now, not ever. 5 men, 1 car, 1 road, and a trail of clues that lead nowhere, except deeper, into something that feels wrong. What happened that night wasn't chance. It was a rupture, something unnatural, something you were never meant to know. But you're here now, so I'll tell you. I'll take you inside, past the headlines, past the easy lies, into the cold heart of this case, where nothing makes sense, and nothing ever will. This is the story of the Yuba County Five, and once you hear it, you'll never think about being lost the same way again. February 24th, 1978, Northern California. The night begins like any other. 5 friends, piling into a white 1969 Mercury Montego, heading to Chico to watch a college basketball game. Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, Ted Wire, and Gary Mathias. They called themselves the Gateway Gators, a Special Olympics team. They weren't outcasts. They weren't reckless. They had plans, dreams, tomorrow. They were supposed to play their own game, one they'd trained for all year. If they won, they'd go to Los Angeles. That was everything to them. This wasn't a group that made sudden detours. They didn't gamble. They didn't party. They didn't drink. They didn't chase chaos. But at 10 p.m., the game in Chico ends. They leave, laughing, excited, stopping at a convenience store, buying snacks, candy bars, milk, soda. And then they drive off, not south toward home, not toward safety, but northeast, up into the Sierra Nevada, into darkness, into snow, onto a road that made no sense. Why? Why would 5 men, terrified of the cold, drive 70 miles into the mountains, in the dead of winter, with no coats, no gear, nothing? Remember this. Every one of them hated the cold. They planned every move. They never camped, never hiked. They weren't impulsive. They didn't do adventure. So why? Why did they drive straight into a blizzard? That car, that white Mercury, would be found the next day, abandoned on a lonely logging road, keys gone, doors unlocked, snacks still inside, wallets untouched, cash untouched, even cigarettes. Everything, except the men, gone. And here's the strangest thing. The car wasn't stuck. Not really. The tires had barely spun. The gas tank was still a quarter full. It could have been driven out. But when search teams arrived, they expected footprints, signs of a struggle, anything. But the snow told its own story. Tracks, 5 sets, leading away from the car, uphill, into darkness, into a storm. Think about that. The car was fine. It could have gone back down the road, to safety, to warmth. But instead, they left it and climbed higher, into the teeth of the mountains. And those mountains, they don't forgive, they don't explain, they take, and they keep. The rescue teams worked for days. Helicopters, dogs, snowcats. They tore through the white wilderness, calling out names that only the wind answered. No blood, no footprints beyond the first few hundred yards. The storm swallowed everything. The men, the clues, the truth. Families begged, cried, offered rewards, but the mountains stayed silent. And then it got worse, because time moved on, and nothing happened. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and the snow kept falling. Heavy, relentless, burying the truth deeper and deeper. Until June, when the thaw began and the mountains started to give back, a ranger, checking an old trailer camp, opened the door to a cabin and froze. Inside, on a bed, under sheets tucked neat and tight, lay what was left of a man, Ted Wire, or what used to be him. He was wrapped like a mummy, skin pale, feet black, frostbite crawling up his legs, his beard grown an inch long, which meant he lived for weeks, 8 weeks, maybe 13. After the night they vanished, 8 weeks, in that cabin, while searchers scoured the mountains, while his family prayed. He was dying, slowly, alone. Ted's body was just the beginning, because once they found him, the mountains started whispering the rest. The search widened, the thaw peeled back the snow, and the horror spilled out. 3 more bodies, scattered in the woods, miles from the cabin. Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt. But the way they were found, it didn't look like survival. It looked like something else, something desperate, something unexplainable. 2 of them had been partially eaten by animals, but their clothes, their shoes, were gone, stripped, torn, swapped. 1 man wore another's pants. 1 had socks that didn't belong to him. Shoes missing, shoes exchanged, like they were ripping clothes off each other in the freezing dark. Why? Why would they do that? And then there was the distance. Some died 2 miles from the car, some 12. Ted, 19 miles, almost 20, through snow, through cold, through hell. Think about that. 19 miles, with no food, no coats, in a blizzard, on a road that led nowhere. And then there's this, the 2 closest to the car. They weren't huddled together. They weren't trying to share heat. They were apart, alone, as if they scattered, as if something broke them, not just physically, psychologically. And Ted, in the cabin, wrapped like a corpse prepared for burial, while the others froze in the dark. But one name stayed missing. Gary Mathias, no body, no bones, just his shoes, found inside the cabin, where Ted died. Why were Gary's shoes there? Did he take them off before leaving? Or did someone else take them? Was Gary the last one alive? Or was Gary the reason the others died? Gary wasn't like the rest. He had a past, a dangerous one, and soon the search for answers would turn to him. The fifth man, the one who walked off the edge of the map, Gary Mathias, the name that haunts this story. Because Gary wasn't like the others. Not exactly. He was 25, a veteran, served in the army, stationed in Germany. But his service didn't end well, because Gary had a mind that turned against him. Schizophrenia, hallucinations, rages, voices in his head. He'd been discharged, put on medication, and for a while, he managed. But there were cracks, episodes, dark ones. Gary once broke into a friend's house, beat him unconscious. Another time, he attacked a woman and stole from her. Yet by 1978, he was stable. At least that's what everyone thought. He lived with his parents. He took his meds. He was clean. And the men trusted him. He was their friend, their leader in some ways. He had street smarts. He'd been through things the others couldn't imagine. And Gary knew survival, army training, combat experience. If anyone could make it out of those mountains alive, it was him. But here's the thing. Gary's medication, his lifeline, was left at home. He didn't bring it. Not a single pill. So picture it. The night stretches long. The storm howls. They're lost, cold, hungry. And Gary is slipping. No meds, no anchor. The voices start whispering again. Or maybe they never stopped. Did Gary lead them into the mountains? On purpose? Was this his plan? Or was he running from something? Something the others never saw. But he did. And ask yourself this. Why were Gary's shoes in that cabin? But Gary was gone, vanished, like a shadow pulled out of the world. No blood, no clothes, no bones, just absence. As if the mountains swallowed him whole, or as if someone didn't want him found. Because here's what they don't tell you. Gary's stepfather once said, "He's alive, he's out there, and he's watching." But from where and why? The more you look, the more this night stops feeling random and starts feeling engineered. 5 men, all cautious, all planners, drive 70 miles into nowhere, up a road they didn't know, a road covered in snow, with no jackets, no gear, no reason. And then they abandon a car that worked, not broken, not stuck, doors unlocked, wallets untouched, keys gone, and they walk into the dark, into the storm, uphill, not downhill toward safety, but uphill toward death. That's not panic. That's purpose. That's movement with meaning. But meaning for what? Some say Gary was hallucinating, that he convinced the others, that something was waiting up there. A light, a voice, a promise. But maybe Gary wasn't leading. Maybe they were following. Because what happens next suggests they weren't alone. A man came forward, a local. He claimed that night, in the storm, he saw them, all 5, near his cabin. But they weren't alone. They were with a woman, carrying a baby, and a man with a beard. He said they asked for help. He refused. He was scared. And later, he changed his story. Who was the woman? Who was the bearded man? Why did the 5 follow them? Or were they running from them? And then there's this. The boots, the clothes, the strange swapping, as if someone else needed them, or took them. And Ted, wrapped so carefully in those sheets. Who did that? Because men freezing to death don't waste time on neatness. They claw, they fight, they rip, they don't tuck. So who tucked Ted in before leaving him to die? And the cabin, with food, with fuel, with matches, all untouched, as if they weren't trying to survive, as if they were, waiting. Waiting for what? Here's what no one likes to ask. What if this wasn't an accident? What if this was designed? 5 men vanish. 4 die in ways that make no sense. 1 disappears without a trace. And the official story: misadventure. Panic in the cold. That's the lie they fed the papers. But think, really think. Ted starved to death, with food in arm's reach. He froze to death, with a heater feet away. Matches, fuel, supplies, all untouched. That's not panic. That's paralysis. That's something breaking the mind. And what about the way they moved? 20 miles. Through mountains. Through snow. No coats, no boots. Why didn't they turn back? Why didn't they stop? Why didn't they fight? It's as if something told them to keep going, even when their bodies were screaming. Stop. Turn around. Run. That's not natural. That's programming. Because here's a truth most men never want to face. The mind can be hijacked, not with chains, not with guns, but with suggestion, with fear, with command. And those mountains, they're full of things no one talks about. Military sites, black operations, experiments hidden in plain sight, things that never make the evening news, but happen anyway. What if the 5 weren't alone out there? What if they walked into something forbidden, something they weren't supposed to see? Some say it was a drug deal, some say a cult, but others whisper about a program, a test, a trigger. Men like Gary, they've been used before. Schizophrenia, hallucinations. You think that's random? Or do you think maybe someone figured out how to make that useful? 5 men went into those mountains, but only 1 walked out, and he left no trail. As if someone erased him, as if someone took him back. Patterns. Always look for patterns, because chaos is never chaos, not when it repeats. Men lost in the mountains, men walking calmly into death, leaving warmth, leaving safety, stripping clothes, swapping shoes, like something hollowed them out, like something else was driving. Does that sound familiar? Because it should. You've heard of Dyatlov Pass. 9 hikers, Soviet mountains. They tore their tent from the inside, ran barefoot into the snow. Some froze, some bled, some were crushed. No clear cause, no logic, just madness. Now think, 19 years later, Yuba County, different continent, same story. A group walks into white silence. Their behavior, insane, suicidal, unnatural. What if these aren't isolated cases? What if they're echoes of something bigger, a pattern of control? Because when the body fails, the mind still fights, unless the mind is broken first. Hypothermia makes men confused, sure, but hypothermia doesn't make you walk 20 miles uphill. Hypothermia doesn't make you ignore food, ignore fire, ignore survival. That's not temperature, that's obedience to something or someone. And Gary was the key. A man with a history of mental breaks, a man trained by the army, a man whose mind was already open to commands, open to triggers, open to whatever they planted. If they planted, what if that night a voice in Gary's head wasn't his own? What if it said, "Go to the mountains, keep walking, don't stop," and the others trusted him, followed him, until the cold claimed them. But here's what should disturb you most. If Gary was triggered, who pulled it? And why? The government. You've seen the pictures. You've heard the story. 5 men, 1 car, 1 winter night, and then nothing. But do you know the part they never put on TV? Because these men weren't nobodies, not in the sense they want you to believe. They were known, not for power, not for money, but for their patterns, their habits, predictable, controlled. You think that's a coincidence? It never is. Ted loved order. Bill loved quiet. Jack loved simplicity. Gary loved the army, loved obedience, loved the thrill of being trusted. What happens when someone studies men like that? When someone sees them as pieces on a board, pieces you can move, pieces you can break. Here's the truth no one talks about. These men were being watched, not in the paranoid sense, but literally tracked. Months before they vanished, family noticed cars they didn't recognize, phone clicks, strange letters. Gary never explained. You think I'm exaggerating? But listen, Gary once told his stepfather something chilling. He said, "People think I'm just sick, but sometimes I do what I'm told, even when I don't know why." Those words, not random, not meaningless. Those are the words of a man conditioned. Conditioned for what? To vanish, to test limits, to disappear so thoroughly that when someone tries to piece it together, they sound insane. And that's the genius of it. Control isn't chains. It's choices. Choices that look like yours, but aren't. What if this whole case wasn't about survival, wasn't about snow? What if it was a controlled event to see if they could make 5 men walk into death without ever laying a hand on them? Think about that. Because the cabin, that's where everything falls apart. Because when you hear what was inside, you'll realize none of this makes sense. Picture it. A ranger stumbles on a shack in the woods, deep in the Plumas National Forest. A hunting cabin, empty for months. But now there's something wrong. The door, broken, glass shattered, snow piled high outside, and inside, silence. Not the silence of nature, but the silence of death. On the bed, a body, or what's left of it, wrapped in sheets. A man who fought to stay alive, Ted Wire, or what they could still recognize, because he was mummified, skin stretched, eyes hollow, hands frozen in a shape that tells you everything. Desperation. But here's the part that makes your blood run cold. The cabin wasn't bare. Not empty. There were supplies. Enough canned food for months. Crackers, beef, fruit cocktail. Untouched. The shelves full. The man starved to death, with food within reach. Why? Why would he do that? Or better, why wouldn't he? Now listen. The heater worked. The fireplace worked. The propane tank was full. He didn't light a fire. He didn't turn on the heat. He froze. In silence. Like someone told him, don't. And that's not all. On the table, there were matchbooks. Several. Not a single one used. The light bulb worked. Electricity worked. But he sat. In darkness. Does that sound like panic? Or does that sound like obedience? Like someone left him there. Not just to die, but to follow rules even as death closed in. This wasn't a man lost in the woods. This was a man following orders. Even if those orders didn't make sense. Even if those orders killed him. And here's the final detail. The clock stopped. The investigators searched that cabin. Every inch. And what they found. It's the kind of thing that makes you stop breathing for a second. Because it didn't belong. Not in a hunting shack, not in the middle of nowhere. First, the food, stacked high, government-issued rations, not hunter supplies, military surplus cans, sealed, clean. Like someone had stocked this place for more than just hunting, like it was a fallback, a safe house. Then, the sheets, the ones Ted was wrapped in. They weren't just bedding. They were cut into strips, almost like bandages. But there was no blood, no wounds. So why tear sheets into strips? Unless you were preparing for something, or someone else was. Next, the footprints. Outside the cabin. They didn't match the men. Too large, too wide, boot prints, heavy, like military boots. And here's the part that chills your bones. They led away from the cabin. Not toward it. Away. As if someone dropped them off. And left. And then, the strangest thing. On the table, under a layer of dust. A small notepad. Pages torn out. Only one remained. With a single word, written in shaky letters. Stop. Stop what? Stop looking, stop moving, stop eating, or stop telling. Whatever it meant, Ted obeyed, right up until his last breath. And this isn't even the worst part, because when they checked the other rooms, they found other signs of life. Coffee cans filled with sugar, plates stacked neatly, clothes folded, like someone had been living there for weeks. But Ted had been dead for months. So who was using that cabin after he died? The official report brushed it off, said it was probably hunters, stragglers. Coincidence. But you tell me, what hunter tears sheets into bandages? What hunter leaves one word, stop, and then vanishes? And the deeper they went into that forest, the more they realized this was not over, not even close. Weeks later, the thaw came, and with it, the forest began giving up its secrets. A search party, made up of deputies, volunteers, and a few men who didn't want their names on record, scoured the ravines, the underbrush, every creek bed, and then a stench, the kind you don't forget, not the smell of a single body, but something worse, something that lingered like a warning. Down in a gully, half buried under snowmelt. They found them, Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling, side by side, like they'd lain down together, and never gotten up. But here's where it gets strange. Their bodies weren't like Ted's. Ted starved. These two looked like they died fast, collapsed where they stood. Their clothes were intact, their wallets still in their pockets. Cash untouched. Rings on their fingers. Not a robbery, not a fight, just death, sudden and quiet. But their shoes told another story, because they weren't wearing their own. Madruga had Ted's shoes on, but Ted was found in the cabin, barefoot, wrapped in sheets. So someone, at some point, swapped them. Why? Why swap shoes in the freezing woods? Unless Ted gave them willingly, or someone else decided who would live and who would die. And then, the position of their bodies, facing uphill, as if they were climbing, trying to get back. But back to what? The car, the road, or the cabin. And here's the detail that makes this feel like something out of a nightmare. They were only 11 miles from the cabin. 11, not 50. Not 20, 11, and yet they never made it, not even close. The coroner said, exposure. But exposure doesn't explain why men in their prime, familiar with the outdoors, wouldn't go back to a warm cabin filled with food. Unless the fragments. They didn't make sense. A few scraps of denim, some bones so small they could fit in a palm, but the jaw was intact, and it still had teeth. Dental records confirmed it. Jack Hewitt, the youngest of the five, the one everyone said was gentle, the one who loved his mom more than anything, reduced to pieces, scattered across the forest floor like someone, or something, wanted him forgotten. But here's the part that made even the toughest deputies stop cold. The bones weren't just scattered. They were burned. Not cremated, not reduced to ash, but charred, as if someone started a fire, then stopped, like they didn't want the flames to finish the job, or couldn't. And there was no sign of a campfire, no pit, no ring of stones, just a scorch mark on the dirt, and the smell that lingered in the soil long after the flames were gone. How does that happen? In the dead of winter, miles from any road, when these men couldn't even keep themselves alive in a stocked cabin. Unless it wasn't them. Unless someone else was out there, watching, waiting, deciding who lived and who burned. The sheriff wrote it off, called it animal activity. Said scavengers scattered the remains. But animals don't build fires. Animals don't burn bones. And when the lab analyzed those bones, they found something else. Heat damage so intense, it would have taken fuel, liquid fuel, something you don't just stumble across in the wilderness. And that's when whispers started. From locals who'd lived in those mountains for generations, they talked about hunters, not the kind that chase deer, the kind that chase people. Sometimes, one old-timer said, they don't find you, you find them, when you take the wrong turn on the wrong night. But the question hung in the cold air like a curse. If Hewitt was burned, if someone had time to do this, why wasn't the fire big enough to destroy him completely? What interrupted them? What made them leave? And who, or what, did they leave for next? Because 2 men were still missing, and the forest was about to give up another secret, one that would make this story darker than anyone could imagine. They found the next clue in the thaw, late spring, when the snow finally melted and the rivers began to roar. A forestry crew cutting a new line stumbled across something in the underbrush. At first, they thought it was an animal. Then they saw the jacket, the tattered red of a windbreaker, half buried in mud. Inside that jacket, bones, but not scattered like Jack Hewitt. These were together, almost intact, as if the man had just lain down, folded his arms, and waited to die. Dental records confirmed it. Ted Wire, the man who once worked at a snack bar, the man who loved sports and candy bars, the one who should have been laughing at a basketball game, now reduced to silent bones under a dripping canopy of pine. But here's the part that froze the blood of every man on that search team. Wire didn't just die. He wasted away. The coroner said he'd lost almost half his body weight. His beard had grown long, which meant he lived for weeks after the others disappeared. Weeks. Alone. In a forest that felt more like a tomb. But it's where they found him that makes the whole story twist. A few 100 yards from Jack's burned bones. Not miles, not days away. Close. So close that if he screamed, Jack might have heard him. If Jack was still alive. And here's the strangest part. Around Wire, they found objects, shredded blankets, flashlight batteries that weren't in any flashlight, even some food wrappers. But no fire, no sign he tried to hunt, no sign he even left the spot. He just lay there and waited. For what? Or who? Some say it proves the men panicked, that they didn't know how to survive. But others look at the distance, the strange burns on Hewitt, the untouched food in the cabin, and they say no. Something else happened, something that made 5 men leave warmth, leave reason, and walk into the black woods to die. And if you think this is where the nightmare ends, you're wrong. Because the last discovery, summer heat baked the Sierra foothills, and the snowmelt turned the creeks into torrents. That's when a local fisherman, casting for trout near a rocky bend, hooked something he thought was driftwood. When he pulled it in, it wasn't wood. It was a human leg, pale, bloated, still wearing a sneaker. The sheriff's team moved fast. They combed that creek bed, and by the end of the day, they had more bones, scattered across the rocks like dice thrown by a cruel god. Those bones belonged to Bill Sterling and Jackie Madruga. 2 more of the Yuba Five. The last 2. Or so they thought. Because remember, Gary Mathias, the one with the military jacket, the one with schizophrenia, was still missing. Sterling and Madruga weren't like Wire. They didn't lie down and wait to die. Their remains told a different story. Sterling's bones were gnawed, chewed down by animals. But Madruga, he was different. His skull was cracked open, not by weather, not by wolves, but by force. Something smashed his head. Hard, and his remains were found far from Sterling, almost as if they weren't together when they died. And that pattern, that scatter, that chaos, it didn't fit with a simple tale of men lost in the woods. No, something broke them apart. Something drove them from one another. Or worse, someone did. But here's the question every investigator asked. Why were these men, 5 grown men, all dressed for a basketball game, miles from the highway, in some of the roughest, coldest terrain in California, on a road that led nowhere but death? The official the cabin. God, the cabin. That's the detail that haunts investigators to this day. It was 20 miles from where the mercury was found, deep in the mountains, owned by the Forest Service. A ranger stumbled on it months later, and inside was horror, horror wrapped in silence. First thing, the door wasn't broken. It was unlocked. Inside, a wood stove, a cupboard stacked with food, enough to feed 5 men for weeks, powdered meals, canned goods, even warm clothing folded neatly, and on the bed, under a heap of blankets, they found Ted Wire, or what was left of him. His body was stretched out. His beard had grown long. He'd been alive for weeks, maybe months, long after the others had died. But he didn't starve right away. No, he lost over 100 pounds, skin hanging like rags on a skeleton, feet frostbitten, toes black. Beside him, on the table, a stack of empty ration cans, and a Bible, open, pages curling in the damp air. But here's the part that makes your blood freeze. That cabin had heat. It had matches. It had fuel. And the cupboards were still half full. Yet Ted let himself waste away, like he was waiting for something or someone, and the others, they never came back. Now think about this. A grown man, starving to death, inside a cabin stocked with food. Why? Why didn't he eat everything? Why didn't he light that stove and fight? Why did he let himself rot in that bed, as if he knew, if he left that cabin, he wouldn't come back alive? And then there was another detail, a terrifying one. Ted's shoes, gone, replaced with someone else's, a larger pair, almost 2 sets of footprints in, 1 set out. That's where the story stopped being strange and became terrifying. Investigators stared at that trail, pressed into old snow. Weather-worn, but clear enough. 2 men went in. 1 man walked away. Who was he? Ted couldn't walk. Not in that state. Not with frostbitten feet and 100 pounds gone. So if someone walked out, it wasn't Ted. It wasn't any of them. It was someone else. And that's when the theories began to crawl out of the dark. Some said it was a predator, not an animal, a man. Someone who stalked them after the game, followed their Mercury into the mountains, and waited for them to break down. What kind of man does that? A hunter, not for deer, for sport. Others whispered about a cult, a backwoods congregation, the kind that feeds on outsiders. Stories of mountain sects, secret rituals, and men who vanish without a trace. People said, those boys didn't just get lost. They were led into those woods, lured by a promise, or dragged by force. Then there's the third theory, the one that feels colder than all the rest. The man in the shadows wasn't a stranger. He was one of them, one of the 5, the weakest link theory. Only here, it's reversed. Because if you believe this version, 1 man outlived the others. And he did things, dark things, to stay alive. Think about it. 4 men die in the snow. 1 wastes away in a cabin. And footprints suggest the coroner unzips the bag. Inside, Ted's remains, fragile as paper, skin clinging to bone. But there, tucked near his shirt, a small folded scrap. The deputy picks it up, opens it, and freezes. 1 word, written in block letters, bold, uneven, like someone wrote it in the dark. Matthias, Joseph Schonz, the man who claimed he saw the flashlights. Remember him? He said he saw figures in the night. One of them, a woman holding a baby. But now, this name changes everything. Matthias was the 5th man. The one who vanished, the one no one ever found, his body, gone. No bones, no clothing, nothing. So why was his name on that scrap? Did Ted write it? As a final message, trying to tell the world who doomed them? Or did Matthias himself leave it? As a signature, a claim, like the killer who can't resist leaving a mark. Here's where it gets darker. Matthias wasn't like the others. He had a history, a shadow that never left him, the kind of shadow polite people ignore. But in the cold, alone, with survival at stake, that shadow might have crawled back to life. What kind of history? Violence, mental breaks, episodes that came without warning, a mind that sometimes just snapped. Investigators wondered, did Matthias lead them into the forest? Was he the reason they abandoned the car, walked into the storm, instead of back toward safety? Did he promise them something or threaten them? And when food ran out, when panic set in, did he turn on them? If Matthias survived, where did he go? How did he disappear without a trace, in mountains that eat everything, except footprints? And here's the most chilling question of all. Why? If that note was a warning, was it hidden so deep inside Ted's clothing, almost as if someone wanted it found, but only much later? Matthias was different, not just different, dangerous. On paper, he was the biggest, the strongest, 6'5", 200 pounds, a former Army veteran. But what the files really whisper is what lived in his mind: schizophrenia, diagnosed, with violent episodes, flash rages that came without warning. He once assaulted a fellow soldier, for no reason. Another time, he strangled a friend, until others pulled him off. No memory of it. At least that's what he claimed. His mother feared him so much. She begged the doctors, keep him medicated. Because without those pills, he wasn't just unpredictable. He was a storm, waiting for a match. And here's what makes the blood run cold. The night they vanished, Matthias left his medication behind. Every single pill, sitting in a bottle on his nightstand, waiting for a man who would never return. So picture this: 5 friends, laughing after a basketball game, driving into the dark. Then, something changes. Matthias, biggest of them all, starts acting strange. Maybe he wants to take a detour. Maybe he insists. And who's going to argue with him? No one. Not when he's towering over you. Not when you've seen what his hands can do. The car stops, not by accident, not because of snow, but because Matthias says it stops. And then, the march begins. 5 men, 1 leading, 4 following. Because what choice do they have? Somewhere in that white wilderness, something snaps. Words turn to shouts, shouts to blows. And the weakest go first. The bodies tell that story. 2 dead by exposure near the road, 1 far off, as if he ran. But Ted died slow, in a shack, with food all around him, like someone was watching him suffer. Was Matthias there, watching, feeding off it? Or had he disappeared already, slipping away into the trees, a ghost with blood on his hands, and voices in his head? If that's true, then the Yuba County Five didn't just vanish. They were hunted by one of their own. Here's where the trail splits in 2. One path screams. Matthias was the predator. The other whispers something far more sinister, something about strangers in the snow. The first theory is brutal and simple. Matthias snapped. Somewhere along that frozen road. Maybe it started as an argument. A clash of words in the dead of night. Voices bouncing off snow-packed trees. Then, one wrong sentence, one spark, and the beast inside him woke up. Think about it. 2 bodies found near the road. They didn't make it far, as if they ran, panicked, maybe chased. One body deeper in the woods, like he tried to escape. But the cold caught him, or something else did. And then Ted wired. Ted, who needed routine to survive. He ends up in that shack, alone, bones rotting while food sat untouched. Why? Why not eat? Unless he wasn't alone at first. Unless someone made sure he didn't. Here's the nightmare vision. Matthias towering over Ted, watching him starve. Because the voices told him to. Because control gave him power. And then, when Ted couldn't move, when his body failed, Matthias walked away, leaving nothing but silence, and a trail of tracks that vanished with the thaw. But there's another path, and this one is colder than the snow itself. A stranger, a shadow in the timberline, a pickup truck parked deep in the woods. Locals whispered about it, a cabin light flickering in the distance. And hunters claimed they saw fresh tracks. Not 5, not 1, but many, heading toward the mountains. Was it a trap, a meeting gone wrong, or something planned long before the basketball game? Some say Matthias knew people out there. Dangerous people. People who didn't like witnesses. If that's true, then the Yuba County Five didn't just die. They were erased, one by one, in the silent heart of the Sierras. And Matthias, he didn't kill them. He led them, straight into the wolves' den. When the snow melted, the mountain began to speak, and what it said didn't make sense. A group of hunters was the first to stumble on it, far from the main search zone, in a clearing where the pines grow so thick. They swallow sound whole. They found shredded clothing, not just torn by branches. No, these rips were clean, like someone cut through fabric with a blade. One jacket was slashed at the chest, another shirt ripped open down the back, as if someone was trying to get something out or in. And on the snow-soaked ground, under months of meltwater, lay something even worse, a pair of shoes, perfectly side by side, with no footprints leading away, none, as if the person who wore them vanished into thin air. The hunters radioed the sheriff. Within hours, the site was swarming with uniforms. Cameras clicked, markers staked in the mud. But there's a detail the press never got, a detail buried in an internal memo that surfaced years later, near that clearing, just beyond the tree line. They found tire tracks, fresh enough to be preserved under the last layers of snow, from a pickup truck, with chains on the tires. But here's the thing. No hunters reported driving up there that winter, and no rescue teams admitted going that far off-road. So whose truck was it? And why was it parked in the exact direction? The men were last seen walking. Investigators flagged it, but in public statements, they brushed it off. Probably unrelated, they said. Probably nothing. But let's be honest. On a mountain that size, in a storm that deadly, there's no such thing as coincidence. If those tracks were real, then someone else was there. Someone who didn't want 5 men alive. Someone who had a plan. And that plan might explain what was found inside Ted's shack. A clue so disturbing, it changes everything you thought you knew. The deputies broke the door open, and the cold air that spilled out felt like stepping into a tomb. The shack was silent, not the kind of silence you hear, the kind that presses on your skull, a silence that tells you, whatever happened here ended a long time ago. The room was bare, one bed, a wooden table, and in the corner, blankets piled high, like someone tried to build a nest, desperate to stay alive. And on that bed, they saw him, Ted, laying still, sheets pulled up, like he had tucked himself in for the night, except he had been dead for weeks. His body told the story, or at least part of it. He'd lost nearly 80 pounds. Every rib like a sharp blade under the skin, his feet, bloated, black, frozen. Frostbite had eaten him alive, but what stopped the deputies cold wasn't Ted, it was what was around him. On the table, neatly stacked, were cans of food, enough to keep a man alive for months. Beside them, a can opener, plain, simple, not the tricky military kind, and yet, every can was sealed, untouched. Ted starved to death, in a room full of food. And then, they saw the notebook, pages filled with names, the names of the 5 men, over and over, written like an obsession. But here's the detail that chills you to the bone. One by one, the names were crossed out, until only Ted's name remained. And then, blank pages. Who wrote that? Ted? Or someone else? Someone who was in that shack with him for days, maybe weeks, before vanishing. And here's the question no one can answer. If Ted had food, if he had heat, if he lived for weeks, where were the others? Why didn't he eat? Unless he wasn't allowed to. Unless someone told him, don't touch it. Not yet. The next discovery would only make things worse. 2 miles from that shack, buried under the snow, they found a tree, and carved into its trunk were marks, straight lines, like someone counting. Counting what? Days? Victims? Or something far more sinister? The tree stood alone, its bark split by deep, deliberate cuts, 5 vertical lines, and next to them, one more, half-carved, like someone stopped mid-stroke. Was it a tally, a warning, or a signature, left by someone who wanted it to be found? Deputies stared, hands trembling, because they knew what 5 lines could mean. 5 men, and the 6th, half-finished. Could it mean one more was supposed to die, or that one escaped? interrupted before the work was complete. And here's the part that makes your stomach knot. The snow around the tree had melted just enough to reveal something buried shallow. A single torn piece of red cloth, bright against the white. Like blood on a shroud, it matched the jacket worn by Jackie Hewitt, one of the missing 5. But Jackie's body wasn't there, not anywhere near. The search widened. Men spread out in a line, boots crunching on hard snow. And then someone shouted, a sound that didn't belong in the mountains, a sound of pure horror. Because they'd found something that didn't fit any theory. There, half buried in a shallow hollow, was a sneaker. Inside it, human bones. The remains were so chewed and broken, it looked like the forest had swallowed them whole. Animals had done their work. But the way the bones were scattered didn't look like an accident. It looked arranged, as if someone placed them there, piece by piece. And here's what froze investigators. Next to those bones, they found playing cards, 2 of hearts, 4 of spades, laid out on the snow. Why? Who would do that? Unless they wanted someone to see it, to understand something, or to never understand at all. The other men, they'd soon be found too. But each discovery would only deepen the nightmare, because the next body would tell a story no one could explain, a story that felt more like ritual than survival. The search team clawed through the snow, a white silence so deep it swallowed their voices whole. Then, a shovel struck something soft, not wood, not earth flesh, cold and preserved in the ice. They brushed it clean, and what they uncovered didn't make sense. A man, lying flat on his back, arms crossed neatly over his chest, like a corpse in a coffin, except there was no coffin, just the endless white of the wilderness. Ted Wire. That was his name, and his body was a story written in agony. His frame had withered to bone. He'd lost almost 100 pounds. His skin stretched like parchment, his eyes sunken deep. But here's what ripped through every man standing there. He didn't die right away. Ted lived, for weeks, after that night in February. Weeks, while the world searched, while his parents prayed. He was alive and starving. How do we know? His beard told the truth, an inch of coarse hair that takes time, and his fingernails, curled and long, the kind you only see on the dead, but grown in the living. And yet, right there, less than 100 feet away, was a fully stocked Forest Service trailer, canned food, powdered milk, heat, matches, enough to keep 5 men alive for months. But the cans, every single one, was unopened. Ted didn't know how to use a can opener. He died, starving, while salvation sat in front of him. But that's not the strangest part. The blankets in the trailer were folded, neat, tucked, as if someone was caring for him, tending to him, making sure he stayed alive until he didn't. No wounds, no struggle, no blood, just slow death and silence. And then they saw it, scratched into the wooden wall of the trailer. One word, one single word, carved deep. Why? Who wrote it? Ted, one of the others, or someone else? Someone watching? And the worst part? There were still 2 more men unaccounted for, and what they found next would turn this case from mystery into something out of a nightmare. Days later, when the snow softened and the forest exhaled its secrets, The final discovery shattered every remaining theory. They were found together, or what was left of them, the last two men, lying in the deep woods, far from the trailer, far from the road, as if they were trying to reach something, or run from something. One body lay face down, clutching a branch so hard, the wood splintered into his palms. The other, half buried beneath a mound of broken limbs and leaves, as if someone had tried to cover him, not with care, but with urgency, like hiding something. The snow had done its work, erased most of the story, but not all. Their bones were scattered, some gnawed, by animals, yes, but also burned, as if fire had kissed the marrow. But there was no fire pit, no charred ground, just bone, clean and strange. And then, the clothes. This is what turned the men's blood cold. One body wore the pants of another, inside out, as if stripped and redressed in haste. Even stranger, pieces of skin, shredded, stuck to the fabric, like someone had peeled it away. But the feet, bare, blue with frost, toenails cracked, toes curled, like they'd been running through hell. Why were they so far from the trailer? Why didn't they all stay together? What drove them into the trees, deeper and deeper, until death swallowed them whole? And then came the most haunting detail. The branches above their bodies, snapped clean, 15 feet high, as if something heavy, something massive, had perched there, watching, waiting. No animal tracks, no stranger's footprints, just two dead men. And the silence of the forest. 5 men went into the mountains that night. 4 came back in coffins. And one, the 5th, was never found. And that was the part that kept the investigators awake at night. Because if he didn't die out there, if he didn't freeze, if he didn't starve, then where the hell is he? And what does he know? The 5th man, the one who slipped through history like a shadow. His name was Gary Mathias. Unlike the others, Gary wasn't sheltered. He wasn't naive. He had a past, and that past was dark. Gary was a U.S. Army veteran, stationed in West Germany, a man who knew weapons, tactics, and survival, but also a man who cracked under pressure, discharged after violent outbursts, haunted by schizophrenia, battling the voices in his head, the kind that don't whisper, they command. And when police searched his small apartment, they didn't find chaos. They found order, books on survival, notes about endurance, plans scribbled like the blueprint of a man obsessed. Now think about that. The others, men who couldn't even cross a highway alone, followed him that night, followed him up a frozen mountain road, and never came back. Here's what's chilling. The car wasn't abandoned in panic. It was parked, perfectly straight, keys gone, doors unlocked, as if someone calmly decided, this is where the road ends. But it wasn't just the car. Up in that lonely trailer, where 4 men died or disappeared, Gary left his shoes, placed neatly by the stove, not tossed, not lost, placed like he planned to return. So what happened next? Did he vanish into the snow, stripped down by cold and madness, bones lost to the wild? Or did he walk away, alive, prepared, leaving 4 friends to starve, because survival doesn't care about friendship. Picture it. The storm raging, the others begging for help, and Gary, that old soldier's mind grinding, calculating, choosing. Because he knew something they didn't. The mountain only feeds on the weak. And the final question, was he the hunter or the hunted? Because no one ever found his body, not a shred of clothing, not a bone. And in that silence, in that empty space, a darker possibility lingers. What if Gary Mathias never died at all? What if the Yuba County Five wasn't a tragedy, but a test, one that only Gary passed? And if he's out there, he's learned one thing, patience, and patience is the deadliest weapon of all. When the truth refuses to show its face, people start building their own. And with the Yuba County Five, theories grew like weeds in blood-soaked soil. The first theory, murder in the mountains. Some say the men stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. A drug deal, a hideout, a secret camp in the woods. And the men who owned that secret didn't let witnesses walk away. It makes sense, doesn't it? Because why else park the car so far up a road that eats tires for breakfast? Why else abandon safety in the dead of night? Unless someone forced you. Then there's the second theory, the one that whispers like a cult's hymn, that they didn't wander. They were taken by men who hunted not for money, but for control, ritual, or something far older than law. In those mountains, secrecy isn't a hobby, it's tradition. And then, the shadow of government experiments. Yeah, I know. It sounds like a fever dream. But think about this. The 1970s were a breeding ground for covert programs. MK Ultra didn't just vanish. It mutated. Gary Mathias had a military background. Psych evaluations. Drug treatments. What if Gary wasn't sick? What if Gary was conditioned? An asset built for survival. Dropped into the perfect scenario to see what happens when everything breaks. And here's the wild part. Every theory, every lead, hits a wall. Because every piece of evidence only deepens the hole. The car, untouched. The bodies, wasted away while supplies sat untouched. Gary, vanished like smoke. Was it murder? Madness? A ritual? A government game? Or something else entirely? Something that doesn't fit into neat boxes. Something alive in those woods. Something that still waits. Because here's the truth. 5 men went up the mountain, and the mountain kept its secret. Even now, 50 years later, it keeps whispering, and no one knows what it's saying. This is where the trail ends, but not the questions, because what happened on that mountain isn't just a mystery, it's a warning. 5 men left a basketball game, smiling, laughing, dreaming of the Special Olympics, and drove straight into oblivion. 4 were found, starved, frozen, buried in snow and silence. 1, Gary Mathias, was never seen again. Not dead, not alive, just gone, like he was swallowed by the earth. And the strangest part? The forest didn't hide them. It displayed them. Bodies left in ways that looked deliberate, as if someone, or something, wanted us to see, wanted us to wonder, and wanted us to never know. The official files, they say, death by misadventure. A phrase colder than the snow that killed them. But we both know that's a lie told in daylight, to keep the night quiet. Because this isn't a story about being lost. It's about being taken. By fear, by madness, or by a force that still lingers in the Sierra Nevada, waiting for the next set of headlights, the next laugh in the dark, the next group that thinks the road home is safe. And here's the question that keeps clawing. If Gary is still alive, somewhere, watching, what did he see up there that made him run so far? He never came back? The truth didn't die in those woods. It's still breathing. And maybe it's closer than you think. Welcome to Yuba County, where 5 men went missing, and only the darkness came back.